Welcome to another edition of Tribute to Blackness, where we explore issues impacting the Black collective on the continent of Africa and in the rest of the Black diaspora. I'm continuing my topic, the demonization of China, our Black people being manipulated into supporting the objectives of white supremacy. And you would recall in the first presentation, I talked about how the mind of white supremacy has produced devilish behavior among many Caucasian people. I also discussed the rise of Caucasian civilization from Columbus right down to our time. And I also talked about some of the evidence that seems to suggest that Caucasian civilization is in decline. I also talked about techniques and tactics of white supremacy, just how white supremacy maintains itself in power around the world. Then we looked at the techniques and tactics of white supremacy, how these techniques and tactics were deployed in Zimbabwe, in Libya, and in Iraq. And that was the second presentation. And now in the third presentation, I'm going to look at the attack being launched against China by the forces of white supremacy. And I want to examine also the role being played by Black people in this current attack against China. Now, in 1792, three ships left Portsmouth, England, to embark on an expedition to negotiate a long-term treaty with China, a trading treaty with China. The man leading the expedition was a man by the name of Lord George McCarthy. Now, McCarthy obviously did not fully appreciate the culture of China, because when he was asked to kowtow or do the traditional bow before the emperor, he simply refused. As Lord Macartney saw it, he was a representative of King George, who in his opinion was just as mighty and as powerful as the Emperor of China. And so he decided that he would not kowtow before the Emperor of China. Now, of course, this displeased the Emperor of China to such a great degree that the British were ordered to leave Beijing, and thus concluded that particular expedition. Now, in addition to being displeased by Lord Macartney, the Emperor of China also came to the conclusion that China was basically self-sufficient and it did not need the goods that the British wanted to trade with the Chinese. The same was not true, however, with the British and the rest of Europe, who had become enamored by tea from China. And so there was a trade imbalance. Tea from China was coming into Britain and the rest of Europe, but the Europeans seemed not to be able to penetrate the Chinese market with any of their goods. And so the British searched for a product that they thought would have been welcomed into the Chinese market, and indeed they did find one. And the product that the British eventually struck on in terms of penetrating the Chinese market was drugs. Yes, you heard me correctly. The British started exporting the drug opium into China, and they discovered that there was quite a big market for opium in China. So the British started trading drugs in China. Now, this flood of opium into China, because opium is a very addictive drug, eventually led to an opiate epidemic in China and all that is involved in an epidemic of that nature. The Chinese authorities, when faced with this opium epidemic, launched a war against drugs. Opium dealers were arrested. Foreign firms who had been importing opium into China They were ordered to turn over their supplies of drugs to the Chinese authorities, who then not only confiscated the drugs but burned them. Now, the British responded to the Chinese war against drugs in a fashion very similar to the Medellin drug cartel in Colombia. When the Colombian authorities decided that they would declare war against the drug cartels in Colombia, the drug cartels turned right around and declared war on the Colombian authorities, and this was exactly what the British did. The British declared war on China over their drug trade. Now, in history, you would hear about the two opium wars, or as I like to call them, the two drug wars that were fought between the British drug dealers and the Chinese nation. These two drug wars would eventually lead to the subjugation of China. First of all, the British subjugated China, and later the French also decided that they would take a crack at China as well. And it was these European incursions into China that led to what the Chinese refer to as the century of Chinese humiliation, which stretched from the 1840s right into the 1940s. Now, in the news today, we hear a lot about the rise of China. Now, from a purely historical perspective, rather than talking about the rise of China, what we should be talking about is the re-emergence of China. You see, as a civilizational state, China has a history stretching back some 4,000 years. Now, when you consider the ascendancy of Britain, Europe, and America, and you compare that to China, the history of Europe's ascendancy is just a mere historical blimp in terms of human history when compared to China. For millennia, China and India were the two most advanced civilizational states. If you wanted to learn about what civilization was about, you had to go to India or to China. Now, as I mentioned in the first part of this lecture, the ascendancy of Europe started with the ill-fated voyages of Christopher Columbus, who is still described in some history books as the man who discovered the New World. Now, we know that Christopher Columbus not only did he not discover the New World, but he was not even the first European to have set foot in the New World. Now, there's a growing body of evidence which suggested that Africans and some Europeans, the Vikings, preceded Columbus in terms of actually arriving in the New World. As a matter of fact, there is a scholar by the name of Van Sertima, Ivan Van Sertima, a Guyanese by birth, and Van Sertima has produced some compelling evidence to show that Africans crossed the Atlantic and came into the Americas long before Christopher Columbus ever made it. There's also some evidence to show that some Viking ships also had arrived in the New World long before the time of Columbus. And of course, the Indians who were already living in the New World, certainly they arrived and discovered the New World long before Mr. Christopher Columbus. So the Europeans were basically Johnny-come-latelys to the whole New World discovery thing. Now, the age of exploration and discovery evolved into the age of colonization. Europeans armed with superior weapons and ships invaded countries that they discovered as a result of Columbus's voyages, and started the campaign of rape, pillage, plunder, and death. When you look at the history of the association of Europe with the countries that they invaded, you will see it as a history of rape, pillage, death, and mass murder. Beginning with the Indians who Columbus and the Spaniards came in contact with, unknown chapter in history was the fact that when the Europeans came into the New World, they came bearing diseases. One such disease was smallpox. And it was basically the smallpox epidemic that broke out among the Indians that basically decimated the Aztec civilization. Now, the Aztecs outnumbered the Spaniards by a great margin, but the disease, smallpox, decimated the Aztec armies to such extent that the Aztecs eventually acquiesced to European conquest, and so the empire came to an end. Now, not only were the Europeans responsible for the genocide of the Aztecs and the Incas and many of the other Indian tribes in the New World, but later when the British settled in America, another genocide took place in the destruction of the various Indian civilizations that existed in North America. The same pattern would be seen in Australia with the Aboriginal people in Australia. They too were the subject of a European genocide. The Maoris in New Zealand also the subjects of another European genocide. Now, the Africans, or rather I should say the Europeans, as they were seeking to find a route into India, they basically sailed around the coast of Africa. And as they were sailing around the coast of Africa, they were setting up forts and trading posts along the coast of Africa. And the Europeans became familiar with the fine specimen of men and women that peopled the continent of Africa. And so the Europeans struck on the infamous idea of capturing Africans and transporting them right across the Atlantic, which became known as the inhuman enterprise of the transatlantic slavery. And this, of course, resulted in the Black Holocaust, where millions of kidnapped Africans were tortured, raped, brutalized, and murdered by devils in white skin. Then, of course, when the Europeans went into the Middle East, there was also a lot of rape and murder and pillage in the Middle East. And then we come a little into more into our century, we see how the Europeans, well, in this case, it was more the Americans who were responsible for a great mass murder of Japanese citizens in the two Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki when the Americans dropped two atomic bombs on these cities. We could also talk about apartheid in South Africa. We could talk about segregation and Jim Crow in the United States. Now, all of these are the legacies of white supremacy as it stretched out into the wider world. Now, today, many people make it seem as though Black and brown people are the face of crime. But when it comes to drug trafficking, human trafficking, rape, plunder, theft, mass murder, Caucasians are in a class all by themselves. Now, like the Chinese and Indian hegemony, the European hegemony was very short-lived. To begin with, first you have when Columbus discovered the New World, there were conflicts between Spain and Portugal about who had the rights to which lands. And this dispute between Portugal and Spain was eventually settled by the Pope in the Treaty of Tordesillas, which separated the discoveries in the New World between Spain and Portugal. Now, of course, the rest of Europe were not content to allow just Spain and Portugal to enjoy the riches from the New World. So eventually the British and the French and the Germans and the Dutch also got involved in the New World enterprise. And we were introduced to the age of the buccaneers and the privateers. Basically, these were pirates who were sailing in the New World and attacking shipping from other European countries. By the way, it was the wealth from the New World which helped in terms of developing industry and the development of European civilization. So we can basically say that European civilization is built on plunder, theft, rape, and mass murder. Then after you had the era where Spain and Portugal were ruling, then the British became basically the most dominant of all the European nations. The British were able to extend their empire in all areas of the world to the extent that the British made the boast that the sun never set on the British Empire. It was a vast empire stretching from Europe to Africa, the Middle East. So huge and so large the British Empire was, as I said, they made the boast that the sun never set on the British Empire. Of course, the British continued to be the dominant force until the end of the Second European Tribal War, which we call the Second World War. Now, as a result of the Second World War, all of the British countries, all of the European countries rather, were in shatters in terms of their economy due to the war. And this then gave the American nation a chance to rise and to assert itself among the community of nations. Now, another nation, a European nation that arose after the Second World War was the Soviet Union. And for a very long period, the Soviet Union and the US acted as the two superpowers of the world, and this launched what was called the Cold War era in history. Now, of course, the Cold War era continued right down until the 1990s, where we all witnessed the amazing, spectacular collapse of the Soviet Union as one Soviet satellite after the other just simply imploded and collapsed until eventually even Russia uh, repudiated communism and started experimenting with a more Western form of government. And so, with the demise of the Soviet Union, the United States was left as the lone superpower within the world. And maybe for a decade and a half, the US was able to exert its influence globally without any real opposition from any country. But eventually, it became obvious that even the enterprise of capitalism in America was in a great decline. And there were a number of things which indicated, which pointed to the fact that capitalism in America was in trouble and was in fact declining. Take, for example, the constitutional crisis that arose when the outcome of the election between Al Gore and Bush uh, was not fixed. The courts basically had to pick a president, which definitely spoke to the fact that there were problems in the American enterprise. Then you had the sex scandal involving President Bill Clinton, and that put the presidency in the spotlight, and it definitely was an incident where the office of the presidency came to a very low point. You had 9/11, where a number of buildings in the US were destroyed by planes which were flown by enemies of the US, according to the popular mass media. And there was such a lack of confidence in elected officials in America that eventually this laid the foundation for the election of America's first Black president in the person of Barack Hussein Obama. Now, white nationalists and white supremacists obviously were very disenchanted and dissatisfied with the election of Barack Obama, and no doubt they saw that as a rallying cry for the re-emergence of white privilege and white supremacy in America. And of course, this led to the election of President Donald J. Trump as President of the US. And immediately upon his election as president, Trump made it very clear that his goal was to make America great again. Or, as the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, said, Trump's main goal was to make America white again. In other words, they wanted to undo those 8 years of the Obama presidency and to reinstall white supremacy at the heart of American foreign policy. And so, as Trump started his presidency, he began a campaign of reversing everything that President Obama had accomplished. He worked at peeling back civil rights legislation, the Obamacare Act, which attempted to give health care to a greater number of Americans. He tore the Iran nuclear deal that had been arranged between President Obama and the regime in Tehran. He pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord. So basically, everything that President Obama achieved during his 8 years in office as president, President Trump came and attempted to reverse. Now, while the American nation was beginning its slow decline, there was another nation on the periphery which seemed to be re-emerging. And of course, that nation was China. By 1910, or rather I should say by 2010, China had moved into the position of the second largest economy in the world, displacing both Germany and Japan while doing that. In terms of foreign reserves, China also had built up the largest amount of foreign currency reserves in the world, in excess of $1 trillion. China also represented about 25% of the global economic growth. Chinese technology also took off, and a number of Chinese companies were able to develop the infrastructure needed for a quantum leap in telecommunication, which we today now call 5G technology. In addition to that, the Chinese were able to compete with America in terms of artificial intelligence and big data collection. So as the American nation started to go into its decline, China started to re-emerge. And this re-emergence of China was not lost on President Trump, who decided very early in his presidency that there was a need to somehow redress the balance of trade between China and the US. You see, China had become the factory of the world, producing goods of comparable quality, but at a far cheaper right price than goods in the US or in Europe. And so China was the preferred place to go to import goods. And President Trump decided that he wanted to put an end to this trade imbalance. So he started a trade war with China, in which he put some tariffs on the Chinese goods entering, on some Chinese goods entering into the US. Now, of course, the tariffs which President Trump placed on Chinese goods basically simply made these goods a little bit more expensive for the final consumers in America. And of course, the Chinese retaliated with tariffs of their own, which then made it a little bit more expensive for Chinese to import American goods as well. Now, another area of conflict between the US and China came in the South China Sea. Now, the South China Sea is one of those important seaways that are very important in terms of shipping. They tell me that about 1/3 of the world's shipping passes through the South China Sea. and that amounts to maybe about $3 trillion in trading annually. The South China Sea is also an area of very lucrative fishing, and I'm told that there are huge oil and gas reserves on the seabed in the South China Sea. So this is a seaway that is of vital strategic and economic importance to China, and indeed to the neighbors of China who also are in that area. As a matter of fact, disputes in the South China Sea have reached such a point that there was one instance in which the Americans had to send some submarines into the South China Sea to de-escalate the tension that was developing between China and some of its neighbors over the South China Sea. Now, another area of conflict between the Americans, the West, and China is what the West calls the concentration camps, where millions of Uyghurs are being held according to the Western media. And of course, the Chinese say that the camps are really re-education camps so that the Uyghurs could be better assimilated into Chinese culture and society as defined by the Chinese Communist Party. So that's another area in which there is tension or conflict between the Americans, the West, and China. They believe that China is interfering with the human rights of the Uyghurs in China. Then in technology, as I mentioned a little bit before, there's a company in China called Huawei, and Huawei has basically been pioneering developing the standards and the infrastructure of 5G technology. Now, Huawei is such a leader in 5G technology that a number of European countries, including Britain and New Zealand, had actually invited Huawei to come in to their countries to set up the infrastructure for 5G technology. However, because of the objections and the opposition that was being raised by the United States, many of these European countries have had to backpedal from their association with Huawei. Now, the US have been pushing the narrative that Huawei and other Chinese companies are basically embedding spyware into their 5G network systems, which would then allow China to spy on Western nations. Now, of course, Huawei and other Chinese companies have denied this accusation. And of course, there's very little evidence to substantiate this particular claim. The US and some of the other European countries have also initiated various forms of attack against Huawei. Some of its employees have been arrested. Attempts have been made to get Huawei employees to spread all kinds of lies and disinformation about the company and its desire to embed spyware in its technology. Then there is the Belt and Road Initiative that China has launched. And basically, in the Belt and Road Initiative, China has basically decided that it wanted to revive the ancient Silk Road trading routes that China had used in the past to trade its goods and services right through the Middle East, Africa, and into Europe, and of course across Asia. Now, of course, the West referred to the Belt and Road Initiative as a massive debt trap, where they were saying that the Chinese were offering huge amounts of money to countries to get the countries into what the West calls a debt trap. Of course, the Chinese have pushed back against this propaganda from the West. And when one analyzes what the Chinese have been doing in the Belt and Road Initiative, it is clear that many countries are enjoying significant infrastructural developments, the building of hydroelectric plants, the building of highways, train networks to move goods and services and peoples in various countries. These have been some of the projects that China has been willing to finance globally. And when one looks at some of these projects, you can see that, of course, they are beneficial to China. As I said a little earlier, China is the factory of the world. China wants to engage in international trading. So the more seaports, the more airports, the more highways, the more dams that are built, the greater the prosperity of other countries, the more they're able to buy goods and services from China. So we should not be naive to think that China is engaged in the Belt and Road Initiative purely to benefit other nations. China is looking to get something out of the Belt and Road Initiative. But at the same time, countries that are accepting these loans from China have to be wise enough to make sure that it is really a win-win situation. Now, take for example, many of the loans that were given to African countries. The African leaders did not negotiate agreements with the Chinese that resulted in win-win situations. And so the Chinese came in, they gave loans to African governments, which had to be paid back with interest. The Chinese brought in their own labor force to do the work. Materials were sourced in China. So China came out big in many of the contracts that they got in Africa. In terms of employment, not even African laborers were involved in some of these projects. And that is something that has to go on the leadership in Africa. They were the ones who were supposed to negotiate deals with the Chinese that were beneficial toward their country. So you can't totally put that one on China. And then, of course, the big story that everybody is talking about today is the novel coronavirus. Now, leading white supremacy nations led by the US are currently trying to drum up support for some kind of economic or even military action against China due to the COVID-19 pandemic. The US and our allies are making the claim that China either developed the novel coronavirus in a lab in Wuhan and released it on the world to destroy the economies of the West. Or there's another version of it which says that the Chinese, they knew about the virus but refused to warn the world in a timely fashion and so contributed to the spread of the global pandemic. Now, the scientific community, when faced with these claims, have both the scientific community and intelligence agencies seem to be in agreement that the novel coronavirus was not developed in any lab either in the US or in China. The consensus is that the novel coronavirus is a zoonotic virus, meaning it is a virus that exists in animals, and in this case, bats have been identified as the primary source. And it is believed that bats may have passed the virus on to other mammals who then passed it on to man. This is how the virologists and the epidemiologists believe that the novel coronavirus has actually emerged. Now, the novel coronavirus was first recognized in China, in the Wuhan region, thanks to the work of Chinese doctors, including Li Wangliang, who alerted the medical fraternity in China that there was a new virus that was behaving pretty much like SARS. Li Wangliang was the first Chinese physician to warn the Chinese medical fraternity that the virus was being transmitted from human to human and that they needed to wear protective clothing when dealing with people who were sick with the new virus. And so a number of lawsuits have been filed against China, both in the US, in Europe, and in other countries, which seek to blame China for the spread of the virus. At a recent World Health Assembly meeting, a coalition of nations called for an inquiry into the origins of the novel coronavirus. Now, Taiwan is a very interesting case which can be used to counter a lot of the propaganda that is being used by the US and a number of other European countries, because Taiwan is right next door to China. Now, when the Taiwanese authorities became aware of the new virus that was impacting on its next door neighbor, China, the Taiwanese authorities started engaging in all the best practices that we know of today: social distancing, wearing masks, doing all that was necessary to flatten the curve and to prevent the spread of the virus in Taiwan. Consequently, Taiwan is one of those few countries that have not had to do any lockdowns. The last time I checked, the number of confirmed cases in Taiwan was below 500, and I don't think there have been 10 deaths in Taiwan as a result of the coronavirus. Now, on the other hand, when one looks at how the United States and its allies in Europe and Australia, how they dealt with the virus, one can see that they just simply did not handle the virus in a way that was conducive to preventing the spread. Like, for example, even if China was slow in sharing information with the world, the fact is that as early as January, February, the world had been alerted to the fact that there was a new coronavirus spreading. The world was made aware that the new virus was being transmitted from human to human, and that it was necessary for people to protect themselves from this virus. But rather than engaging in some of the same best practices that were being implemented in Wuhan and in Taiwan and South Korea and some of the other neighbors of China, the West, including the United States, basically did nothing. So by the time the US and Italy and Spain and France got around to imposing lockdowns, the new virus had already taken a firm footing and firm roots within both Europe and in America. So eventually, the epicenter of the virus shifted from China, from Wuhan, to Europe, where Italy was the epicenter for a while in Europe. And then the United States became the epicenter. And at present, the United States has about 1.5 million confirmed cases and is now heading quickly toward 100,000 deaths. The last current figure I looked at, it was about 93,000 deaths. So one can clearly say that the US and Europe dropped the ball in terms of its handling of the coronavirus. So if they're going to blame anybody, they have to blame the individuals who are the political leaders in these countries. As President Obama said recently in his commencement address, many people who are in leadership position clearly do not know what they are doing. And of course, that has been seen as a very veiled attack against the mishandling of the crisis by President Trump. And so every voice and every nation that has dared to challenge white supremacy has been targeted for demonization and destruction by the forces of white supremacy. I think about Nelson Mandela, Winnie Mandela, Steve Biko, Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, Malcolm X, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez, Che Guevara, Robert Mugabe, Muammar Gaddafi. Each of these individuals was demonized by the forces of white supremacy and targeted for destruction. Some even paid the ultimate price of their lives. Now, Black people historically have been the greatest victims of white supremacy. We've seen the tactics and techniques of white supremacy employed time and time against every prophet and messiah that has risen up in our midst. As the Exhibit A victim of white supremacy, I find myself at a loss trying to understand the quick way in which many Black people have jumped on the anti-Chinese hate bandwagon. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not suggesting that some Chinese are not as racist as some Caucasian people. Many Chinese are as anti-Black as are many Caucasians. What I'm questioning, however, is the timing of these xenophobic videos that have been circulating on social media, showing Chinese beating up Africans, driving them out of their homes, and preventing them from entering into places of business. As Black people, we have been very busy circulating these videos over the past few months. But how many of us have bothered to fact check these videos to find out when the events took place and what were the circumstances that led to the content of the videos? Now, Chinese have enforced some very draconian measures on the Chinese population to control the spread of the novel coronavirus. And it would be very easy to mistake some of these draconian measures that the Chinese applied even to their own citizens as being racial discrimination by Africans and others. When one looks at how the Chinese locked down Wuhan and the harsh penalties that were being inflicted on Chinese nationals for breaking curfew, Africans living in China obviously would have come under the same kind of regimentation. And because of the fact they are foreigners and different, it may have easily appeared as though they were being discriminated against. Now, in some of the cases, it is quite possible that there was discrimination, but we have to bear in mind that we're looking at a country trying to stop the spread of a virus and locking down the country and imposing martial law on the country. So it means that everybody across the board would be faced with some very harsh conditionalities, including Africans living in China. And of course, Black people, we know for a fact that we are not the most cooperative people. We like to talk back, we like to argue. Sometimes we do not even like to follow rules for our own good. And of course, this kind of behavior could result in high drama and high adrenaline incidents, especially in a racialized setting. Now, it is very clear that China is being targeted by the forces of white supremacy. And the question is, how should Black people relate to this propaganda campaign that is being launched by the West against China? Now, if you're a Black person with a genuine reason to distrust Chinese, I will not try to suggest that you should say anything positive about China and its people. The most I could say to you would be just make sure that you are not being used by white supremacy to spread xenophobic propaganda against China or indeed against any other nation. If, on the other hand, you're like me and you have no axe to grind with China and its people, then you should raise your voice in protest against the high-handed racist policies of white supremacy that are currently being directed against China and its people. Make no mistake about this. After white supremacy has gone after China and has gotten its pound of flesh, white supremacy will be back to its favorite pastime, which is the destruction of the Black race. Thanks for viewing this edition of Tribute to Blackness. Please remember to subscribe, to like, and to share this video with your friends and with your contacts. Now, in closing, here's a question I would like you to consider and to comment on. Has the presence of Chinese brought any positive benefits to your country or to your region? Feel free to share your thoughts in the comment section below. Asante sana rafiki zangu na kwaheri, which is Kiss Swahili for thank you very much, my friends, and goodbye.